Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Musoff. Today we are going to be talking about solving rational equations, and what we mean by that are equations that have an exponent, but it's a fraction. Right? So something like that, for example. Okay. Before we start doing that, let's talk about something a little easier, and that's just regular exponents. Let's make sure we know how we would solve those. So for number 1, it says solve x squared equals 9. Well, maybe you remember, but to get rid of an exponent like 2, we use a root. So in this case, a square root. So I would square root both sides. And one thing you might not remember, but it's super important, is that anytime you take the even root of a number, we have to remember a plus or minus. So there are two answers. And that should make sense, because if you think about what x squared equals 9 means, that's saying some number, if I square it, is going to equal 9. Well, if I square 3, that's the one we know best, right? That gives us 9. But if I square negative 3 times negative 3 is also going to give you 9. So you get two answers. So you end up with here is plus or minus 3, positive or negative. Alright, now some of you might ask, like, why doesn't that work for odd roots? Well, let's see. So number 2, it says solve x to the third equals 27. And again, to get rid of an exponent, we would do a root, so we would do a third root on both sides. But we could also just think about this. This is saying what number, if I raise it to the third power, would give me 27. And some of us might know, some of us might not. But 3, if I raise it to the third power, so if I do 3 times itself 3 times, that's going to give me 27. But does that work with negative 3? Well, negative 3 to the third is negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. So negative 3 times negative 3 would be positive 9, and then times another negative 3. That would give me negative 27. But this didn't say negative 27. So that's why for odd roots it doesn't work, because for odd roots the negative actually ends up in your answer, but for the even roots it turns positive. So for this odd root, I'm just going to get a single answer, which is x equals 3. Okay, so the big important thing to remember here is when we take the even root of something, we will have two solutions, and that'll come from one positive, one negative, our plus or minus. And sometimes you might get incorrect solutions or extraneous solutions, so we must check our answers. We're going to talk about that. When we take an odd root, we'll have just one solution, so there will be no plus or minus for odd roots. Now the tricky part about this problem is that, or these problems we're about to do, is that it's not so easy as just looking at the root, because we're going to be seeing exponents that are fractions. And we have to make sure we remember which part of the fraction is going to represent our root. So the idea is when we see something like this, we would know that the bottom number here, so the bottom number, is going to be our root. So the root is always going to be in the bottom. Okay, and so that's the number we're going to be looking at. So for example, if I look at 1 through 4, is it an even root or an odd root that's being taken? Be careful. So I'm going to look always at the bottom of my fraction. So here the bottom number is a 5, and I know 5 is an odd number, so that's an odd root. Here my bottom number is a 4, and 4 is even, so that one would need a plus or minus. Now it's these last two you got to be really careful, because 6 to the second, remember, if it's not a fraction, to turn it into a fraction, you put it over 1. Well, 1 is an odd number. So basically, if it's just a regular old number, that'll always be over 1. Let's try that again. And so because 1's always going to be odd, that'll always be odd. Okay? And again, remember, the odd ones don't need the plus or minus, but the even is when we would put it there. Alright, let's try some solving. So we're going to solve these problems. It says, remember to always check your answer. Check your answer. That's what we're going to do in this box over here. And you could get extraneous solutions. That's why we check. Okay, so the order we kind of go in for these solving problems is reverse PEMDAS. You might have heard that before. So reverse PEMDAS is SADMEP. That's reverse PEMDAS, which means we do addition and subtraction first. division and multiplication, exponents, and then parentheses. That's the order we go in. So we would look at this problem, and we would say, okay, there is multiplying going on. Some of you might say, oh, there's addition happening, but that addition is inside of an exponent. And exponents we have to get rid of before we can get rid of the inside of the parentheses. Sorry, that's what I meant. So parentheses come last. Exponents will come right before that. So any of these four, they're always going to be our first steps. All right, so here are times 3 to get rid of it. I'm going to divide by 3. And that cancels out, so I'm just left with x plus 2 to the 4/3. They undo each other, I should say. 243 divided by 3, I would type that in my calculator. I'd get 81. And now this is the new part. So we haven't talked about how to get rid of an exponent when it's a fraction like this. And what we're going to do is the same way we get rid of fractions in a normal problem, which would be to multiply by the reciprocal. The only difference is we're not going to multiply, because this isn't multiplying, right? This is an exponent. So we're going to raise both sides to the reciprocal exponent. So just like that. All right? And this is the part where it's so important to check and see whether you have an even or odd root. And some people get confused about which exponent to look at because there's a lot of them. Well, remember, over here, those cancel out. They undo each other, I should say. So those aren't the ones I'm looking at. I'm going to look at the one on the other side. The bottom number is my root. And the bottom number here is 4. 4 is even. So that means plus or minus, yes, we need it. So for this problem, I'm going to write plus or minus, and then whatever 81 to the 3/4 gives me. Okay. On the other side, like I said, the exponent undoes the other one, so you're just left with what's inside the parentheses. Here, that's x plus 2. And then I'll turn to my calculator to help me out here. Keep in mind, this is an exponent, so we're going to type this in parentheses 81 to the caret parentheses 3 divide 4. All right, that's how it'll look in our calculator. So let's throw it in there real quick. Parentheses 81 caret parentheses 3 divided by 4. And sometimes it'll give me a nice number. Perfect. If it gives you a decimal, you don't write the decimal. We just leave it as that as the original piece. But here it's a nice number. So 27. So I end up with x plus 2 equals, don't forget the plus or minus, and then 27. Now when you get a plus or minus, that means you actually have two equations. So I'm going to split this up. I'm going to write x plus 2 could equal positive 27, which you could put a plus there if you want, and then x plus 2 could equal a negative 27. That's what the plus or minus means. And then these are the final equations I'm going to solve. So now to solve this, I'm just going to subtract 2 from both sides. That gives me x equals positive 27 minus 2 is positive 25. And over here, I'm going to do the same thing. Subtract 2. But I get a different answer because negative 27 minus 2 is negative 29. Now, I'm not going to circle these yet because I have to check my answers. So to check them, I know I have two different ones. I'm going to split this in two. I have x equals 25, and I have, I guess that wasn't very even. I have x equals negative 29. And to check them, we're just going to plug them back into our calculator. I'm just going to write it down. So 3, and then parentheses, it'll be 25 plus 2 to the 4/3. And we're checking if it equals 243, question mark. So I'll type that in my calculator. 3 parentheses 25 plus 2, close parentheses, caret. Make sure you use parentheses around that fraction. Oops, what was it? 4/3. Not 43, 4/3. And I'll press enter and it gives me 243. Whoops. That's what I wanted, so check that one works, I'll circle it. And I'll do the same thing with negative 29. One thing that's sometimes helpful is you can press second enter and it'll pop up the same thing you typed in. Sometimes that makes it easier to plug in a different number. The one thing you got to be careful of is sometimes if it like a negative 29 will take up one more space, so I have to finish retyping that whole piece. Okay. Press enter, that gives me 243 as well. I'm just going to write it down. Negative 29 plus 2 to the 4/3. And it does equal 243. Check, so I'm going to circle it, and those are my two answers. Alright, flip it over. Let's try this again. Okay, now remember that one we ended up with an even root, so we put the plus or minus. Let's see if that same thing happens here. Okay, so I'm going to start again by getting rid of, remember, reverse PEMDAS. So get rid of any addition or subtraction first. And there's no parentheses here. So that means I don't have to worry about the fake addition and subtraction that we actually save for the end, because that's only when it's inside parentheses. Alright, and then I'm going to get rid of this multiplication here by dividing. So x to the 3/2, and that's going to be 125. Awesome. And then the last thing now is to get rid of this exponent, which is a fraction. So I'm going to raise it to the reciprocal, which would be 2/3. Now remember, these two cancel out. That's not what I care about. It's this one. I'm going to look at the bottom number. That's a 3. 3 is odd, so no plus or minus. So I'm going to have x equals no plus or minus, just 125 to the 2/3. And I'll type that in my calculator. 125 2/3. Parentheses, remember, they're mostly important when you have negatives or fractions. So that's when you should really try to use them. Alright, 25. Now before I circle it, I'm going to write it off to the side here and check it out. So 2 parentheses 25 to the 3/2 plus 5. Does it equal 255? And I'll type it in my calculator and see. 225 3/2. Sometimes I mix up my exponents, so I always like to check. Remember, move back down, and then plus 5. 255. Checks out, so that's my answer. Alright, pause the video for a second. Make sure you're understanding these steps, and if you're not understanding them, write down any questions you might have. Alright. Well, if you don't have any questions, then we'll keep moving on to our last problem. Okay, so we're going to do the same kind of thing here. Addition, not in parentheses, the one outside the parentheses. We're going to take care of that first, so subtract 6. And that'll give me x minus 4 to the 3/2 equals 0 minus 6. That's just negative 6. And then exponent comes next, so I'm going to raise it to the reciprocal, 2/3. And see how this is a negative number? That means parentheses are important. Okay, I'm going to look at the bottom number. That is odd, so no plus or minus. Okay, so here these just cancel out. I'm just left with x minus 4. And over here I'm going to check in my calculator. Negative 6 to the 2/3. Parentheses with the negative. Parentheses with the fraction. Oops. And, I get this decimal. So we do not want to use the decimal because it's not super accurate because we have to round it. So I'm going to just go back to what I originally typed in, and that's what I'm going to use as my answer. So negative 6 to the 2/3. Now the annoying thing about that is we have this big mess as part of our answer, but the nice thing is that when it comes to finishing this problem, I'm going to add 4 to both sides. Well, since these aren't like terms, I don't actually add here. So all I would end up doing is saying x equals negative 6 to the 2/3, and then a plus 4 on the end. Now, checking our answer can be a little challenging because we have kind of a messy answer. So we just have to be careful with how we type it in. Okay, so that's why it's helpful to write it first. So I would do parenthesis, because that's what's there. And then instead of x, I would put this in. So another parenthesis for this one. And then negative 6 to the 2/3 plus 4. Okay, I close that parenthesis up. Then there's another minus 4 before I close the outside parenthesis. And then it's to the 3/2 plus 6. And I want to know if that equals 0. Now this is kind of difficult to type in. You do have to be careful with your parentheses. So I already have it typed into my calculator. So double check that you're typing it in correctly. Notice how I have the same parentheses that we wrote down. And I'm going to press enter. And it gives me 12. So I'll look back here and I'll say, 12 does not equal 0. So that's no good. So I'm going to cross this out. we're going to write no solution. And that's it. Thanks for listening.